Well, it is 2024. This podcast is not quite a year old, but we started at the start of 2023. It is now 2024. Gotta ask, any New Year's resolutions, any plans for this new and glorious year, aside from, a really exciting election season that will no doubt titillate and excite us all?
I'm still thinking that one of them's not going to make it to November. I don't know which. You know,
I'm not sure, but I was looking at those numbers in Iowa, and it's like Trump is just doing layups. It's right now. This is a couple weeks to those of you who are listening at another time. It's a couple weeks to the Iowa caucus, Republican Party, and I mean, right now Trump is like putting up LeBron numbers in the primaries. So
yeah,
maybe we'll look back on this and feel a fool, but.
yeah. Either one of them could fall down a flight of stairs or catch
Oh, they
COVID again
could
or
just
something.
die. And I don't mean that in some threatening way. I just mean like they are both old ass
Old
men
as dirt.
who
Yeah.
have
And
both
so,
had COVID at least once apiece. I'm
I
just
mean,
saying.
their New Year's resolution, I think, first and foremost, is to make it through the year.
Hmm.
Mine, incidentally, is to start socially transitioning. It's something I've recently figured out about myself. I feel much more authentic and confident as she, they. And as part and parcel of that, I really vibe with the name Lenore. Of course, y'all who know me IRL, my other name is fine for now, but I will be eventually retiring that. So,
Okay. Okay. Thank you, Lenore, for that. We're ringing the new year. Y'all thought the mammothification surgery. Yeah, what did they do in the mammothification surgery? That's my real question, because clearly it's led to, time for introspection and whatnot.
yeah, we're forging an arc here. We're forging an
Okay.
arc here, and I like where it's leading.
Okay.
Unfortunately, the Essequibo thing didn't work out, but who wants that kind of responsibility?
That's a good point. So you got the consolation prize of dealing with a lot of a non-binary woman. So that's cool.
Hmm.
That you decided I will have a lesser stress and I'll do that, which is, some would say that managing the Essequibo would be less difficult, but you've taken this upon yourself.
Hmm.
Um,
I'm just I'm
so
just I'm
shout
just
out.
collecting labels for your racist Facebook uncle to rant about.
Yeah, the trans, communist, woke, what else? Uh, uh,
That pretty much
uh,
covers it, I think.
Anime watching,
Mammoth dabbling.
mammoth dabbling, Essequibo ruling.
They really get horned up about the Essequibo.
Socialist shelf. Be good, goods, and organize yourself. Socialist shelf. Be good, goods, and organize yourself.
You're now listening to Socialist Shelf Radio.
Welcome to the Socialist Shelf, the podcast that is serious with bit characteristics and a bit with serious characteristics. Welcome back. It's me, Jacob, with Lenore. How are you
What's
doing
up?
today?
I can't complain. I tell you what, Francis Spufford, the guy we're talking about today, real interesting fellow. Real interesting fellow.
Well,
Similar,
I would call him just from this book, Kim Stanley Robinson light. But
hmm.
but like not. No, that's not a great way. Okay. Maybe I'll flesh this out further on. I'll continue with what you were saying there.
Well, no, I mean, the Kim Stanley Robinson comparison is apt. I mean, he has read Robinson, as
Hmm.
the endnotes reveal. He's got that similar dedication to, dedication to detail and sort of forging an arc, as we said, out of the minutia of the world, right? Stuff that, in his words, resists being written about. The
Hmm.
the gritty details of everyday life and what they mean in the macro. And what do they mean in the macro? Well, according to Spufford, it means that the USSR was ultimately doomed. because we are talking about his 2010 book, Red Plenty, about the Soviet Union during the Khrushchev-Brezhnev era.
And let me tell you, once you're done with this, you'll feel like you've read plenty. Am I right?
Always,
Yeah,
literally
okay.
always.
Always.
It's a blessing and a curse.
Blessing and a curse. I'm gonna confess something here. When I went into this, when I recommended this, and I'm not saying I regret doing this book, but I genuinely thought this was a speculative sci-fi novel.
Yeah.
Like, I thought that going into this book, and then I realized about like a tenth of the way, and I was like, oh wait, no, this is historical fiction.
I don't regret any book we've ever done.
Yeah, I guess not after the fact. I've certainly regretted it during. This one, not nearly the most have I regretted. My problems with this are not ones that I'm like, oh my God, I can't believe I spent time in my life reading this.
Mhm.
But no, I did, like, full disclosure, think this was a sci-fi novel. So make of that what you will.
There's shades of it. There's elements of it. There are people grappling with the numerics of it, with the emerging field of cybernetics, which at the time must have seemed like science fiction working itself out IRL. Um, I it's still a label that I struggle with personally. Like, I'm perfectly content to read this as historical fiction.
I think that's the best way you can describe it.
Yeah.
It's not. We can get into it after, like, we kind of do the author bio, but I will say, this left me really wanting a speculative fiction novel about if this whole thing had worked. Like,
Mhm.
if all of it, like, if they had invented a supercomputer in like 1960 or something like that, and like every wild Khrushchevian fantasy like had come to pass, like every over the top pronouncement, like they had been able to pull it off, but through like some magical feat of science, what that would look like, would there have been a World War III? Like, what would have happened? I'm interested in that now. And Red Plenty would be a hella good name for that as well, even though it's now taken. But let's talk about Francis Spufford, because I know you've got a author bio on him prepped for us.
Yes, Francis Spufford. Born in 1964 in England. He is a Cambridge man. His parents were Margaret and Peter Spufford. They are social and economic historians, respectively. So he comes from that
British
background.
people love to be named Spufford.
Spufford.
Spufford. Okay.
Fancy a bit of. I'm not going to get
A
into
bit
it.
of spuff. Margaret Spufford as his mom. I'm like, I'm sorry, that sent me. And Margaret Spufford at Cambridge.
He does. He
I'm
does
sure
have
she's
some.
a lovely woman.
Well, unfortunately, she's no longer with us. But I imagine, yes, she is. She
Mhm.
she was lovely in her time. Francis Spufford does have a bit of spuff, as we'll find out, and
Mm.
as we'll no doubt figure out a meaning for. He got his BA in English, hey, fellow, from Cambridge in 1985, and went on to work at the book publisher Chatto and Windus. Again, very, very
British names love to be Chatto and Winded.
Chatto and Windus, Mace Windus,
Come on.
where he was chief publisher's reader, as I understand it, essentially, uh, roughly equivalent to an editor-in-chief
Mm.
from 1987 to 1990. So he himself starts writing in 89. That's the year that his sister, tragically dies of a very rare genetic disease. And he points to that trauma as what really drove him to start, creating something, right? To start really forging something out of the sorrow that he was feeling. Um,
We are in dangerous territory of being too sued by Taylor Swift again, so we need to move on from 1989 as quickly as
oh,
possible.
yeah, she's copyrighted that year, hasn't she? Well,
TS
1988,
1989.
1988 plus one, let's say. So in 1988 plus two, he starts being a full-time writer. He moves on to being a writer in residence in '04 at University College London. He's a Royal Literary Fund Fellow at Anglia Ruskin University from '05. He's bouncing around universities. From '08 till the present day, he starts teaching creative writing at Goldsmiths College in London. In 2018, he makes full professor. Now, his first book is 1996's I May Be Some Time, Ice and the English Imagination. So the title, this is wild to me. The title comes from the last words of Antarctic explorer Lawrence Oates. He was on Robert Falcon Scott's expedition. And while enduring gangrene and frostbite, right, he leaves his trapped companions with those words, I may be some time. And he chooses to go walk into the Antarctic blizzard and die so they wouldn't have to care for him. which, spoilers for 112 years ago, they all die anyway. But that's what intrigues Spufford, right? Why would people do this shit? Why would people go to Antarctica? And he writes about the cultural history of England and the polar regions, right? How they're discussed in fiction, how England's culture and sort of global imperial reach, right, inculcates this sort of audacity, right? And there's a Robert Harris in 1998 in the New York Times Book Review says that when he pours on the literary criticism, getting through some of his prose can be like man-hauling sledges over a great wide expense, which
Dang.
kind of familiar. But ultimately, like, kind words for the book overall, kind words for the insights, and it's something that I tend to agree with. There's parts of Red Plenty that are very, very skimmable, but which you can see, tortured as they are, you can see genuine metaphors and insights that he's forging out of the minutia.
Yeah, none of it's thoughtless. Like whether or not you like the thoughts, that's a separate thing. But like you have to respect there is a remarkable attention to detail. Everything is crafted with incredible intent.
Yes. Little historical anecdotes plucked out of what he's read. There's stuff that's not necessarily anachronistic, but there's events, there's people, there's quotations that are moved around here and there for sort of narrative convenience, and he straight up admits to that. It's like editing a picture, right?
Sure.
There's a craft to it. You just have to be honest about it. Now, nonfiction is where he starts, right? And he has got a memoir then in 2002, The Child That Books Built, which is about his own literary history, right? What books have had the biggest impact on him. Famously, Neil Gaiman read this book and he's like, okay, there's one less book that I need to write now. So he follows it up with Backroom Boys the following year, which is a history of British engineering. The bit of a delay, and then Red Plenty drops in 2010. And this book is historical fiction, as I said, set during Khrushchev, Brezhnev. It's his first fiction work. Now, there's a piece in The Guardian that I was reading from 2021 that discusses his literary trajectory here, right?
Yeah, I actually read this as well.
Yeah. The one that's like, I'm still so angry about what they've done to this country.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so then, like, Spufford himself says that he stuck around in nonfiction for a while out of cowardice, right? I revere fiction writing, he says. I didn't want to do it badly. There is something uniquely self-exposing about fiction. Every bloody sentence, no matter how much in theory it is removed from you, is reflecting your sense of how human behavior works. Which dovetails pretty revealingly with his approach here and in his work in general. He says himself, I like stuff. I like the complicated, fractured, broken up, difficult surface of the real world. I like things that resist being written about. I'm interested in how the world works and what people do in it. So this book was longlisted for the Orwell Prize for political writing and translated into 9 languages. Apparently, Jacob, you were telling me some socialists like it quite a lot.
Okay, so none that I know, but I was reading online and I repeatedly, like, in certain forums, there's like certain socialists who were like, there's actually a lot, like, as a socialist, there's a lot we can learn from this. I like this book a lot. Like, just read it and go in with an open mind. I saw that like a handful of times. And like, so that's pretty anecdotal. Like, I haven't seen endorsement from like a socialist organization or something like that by any means. But individuals, like, it is a repeated thing of like, hey, there's criticism here, but it's like criticism to take to heart and we can like learn from it and this, that, and the other. So,
You know who really, really likes this book? Libertarians.
Yeah, I can imagine.
Yeah.
I can only imagine.
Spufford identifies as a middle class socialist, and to his amusement, if not to our surprise, Red Plenty has apparently gotten popular among libertarians. I love my frothing right wing American readers, he says, which, I mean, in a sense,
Someone's got to.
Yeah, it's that thing of where, like, you write something and it takes off with an audience that you really didn't anticipate it taking off with, but at the same time you're like, okay, at some point you have to have thought, all right, I'm writing a critique of the first major workers and peasant state. It's
Right.
going
It's a critique of a planned economy, fundamentally.
Yes, exactly. And it's going to take off with people who are, fundamentally against planned economies no matter what. I don't blame him for that.
I mean, yes, and I mean, like, I guess I don't necessarily. I mean, I think that that's a natural outcropping of what you're going to accomplish here, right? Like
Mm.
there will be books where I'll be like, it doesn't make sense that it picked up. Like there'll be things like American Psycho, where like Sigma males, it's like that people who are being unironic about being like a Sigma Alpha incel actually like American Psycho and think you should be like Patrick Bateman. In that case, that's insane. I can't conceive of how that would happen.
Hmm.
I knew reading this book libertarians would like this book though.
Hmm.
I think that there is a little bit of a difference there. Like I think that like he can at least receive some blame.
There
If
are
not,
places where it's indistinguishable from a critique of the planned economy, like in concept, isn't it?
but what is my question is he doesn't ever spell, and it's not the role of this book to spell out what he thinks a better system would be. But
No.
you said he called himself a middle class socialist. There's some moments in here where he kind of throws in some praise for social democracy. So what is he sort of like a Jeremy Corbyn guy or what what do you think?
I I don't know. I would have to read the rest of his work to really get a sense, because I mean, Corbyn has some of the Corbyn has some of the anti-imperialist chops, certainly when he's talking about Palestine.
Oh,
Um,
I just meant like because he lives in the UK and that's like the furthest left political option in the UK.
I mean, middle class socialist, right? It's interesting that he emphasizes that to me. It's you get the sense, I think, that it's a socialism that he believes in a sort of socialism that's like, okay, well, we can sort of reform our way into this, right? We can curtail the worst excesses of capitalism and maintain largely the standard of living that I'm familiar with. That's what the phrase means to me.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Well, I'm interested. I may revisit him, but we were talking about it on our own time. I know right now, I don't know if it's out yet or it's about to come out. He's got a new book called Cahokia Jazz.
Yes.
You know
Yes. Yes.
anything about
Yes.
this?
Yeah. It's a
Or
murder.
Cahokia, maybe?
Cahokia. I think Cahokia. It's been a while since I studied about it. I do remember from my eighth grade Georgia history class, Cahokia, right, was a city in roughly where Illinois is now, southern Illinois. It's a Native American city that had fallen by the time that Europeans came, but it is a murder mystery set in a version of that city that has survived into the present day during
So this
that
is kind of speculative
1920s.
fiction.
Yeah, and that
Okay.
intrigues me. That really intrigues me because I mean it's impossible to imagine. I mean, not impossible to imagine, but it's impossible to predict with any degree of certainty what that would have looked like. But it
Okay,
intrigues
I'm
me.
looking at it here. It's out, but it's not out in America yet.
Yeah, it's going to be out in America this year. He's written some
That's
other
interesting.
he's written some
Interesting.
other stuff too. Unapologetic followed in 2012. It's a defense of Christianity against Dawkins and that whole new atheist strain of thought. He himself is a practicing Anglican.
Hmm.
His first proper novel now is Golden Hill in 2016. It's a period piece set in 18th century New York. That wins a Costa for first novel, a handful of other prizes, shortlisted for several more. He's got a book of essays that follows in 2017. He writes Light Perpetual in 2021. That's longlisted for the very prestigious Booker Prize, right? And this is interesting to me. It's about an incident where a V-2 rocket killed 5 children in a war worse in 1994, right? They were murdered by Nazis. And it's about what their lives might have been like if they hadn't been killed.
Hmm.
And he teaches, Spufford does, next door to where that happened.
Very interesting. So it's
Yeah.
it's a more introspective, like what it's like a sort of an imaginative thing of like what would have happened if they hadn't been killed.
Yeah, just where these
Huh.
kids would have ended up.
That's cool.
He's also a nerd. The Guardian points out in that article that I mentioned parallels to Le Guin and C.S. Lewis. He self-describes in his Amazon bio as a fan of Joss Whedon and Aaron Sorkin. And the year before COVID kicked off, he wrote a fan fiction novel called The Stone Table, set between the
Wait a
magician's nephew,
second.
set between the magician's nephew and the Lion, the Witch, and the
Oh
Wardrobe.
my
It's
God.
a Chronicles of Narnia fan fiction novel. Only his friends have read it. He wants C.S. Lewis's estate to let him publish it. If that doesn't happen, we're not going to see it till 2034 because that's 70 years on from the death of C.S. Lewis. But
There's the Anglican coming out. Oh
yep,
my
yep, yep.
God.
But yeah, so mark your calendar, Jacob, because in 2034 we're going to see some apparently really faithful Lewis prose from
That's
this guy.
fantastic. I love that. I love that.
So yeah, fan fiction writer, son of two historians. You know, I see a lot of hmm, I see a lot of familiar things in somebody who does really deep historical dives. You know, the difference between us being that he actually sits down and writes.
Hey, I do it on occasion. I do it on occasion,
Oh
but
no, I'm talking about myself.
oh no,
You're
I'm
the
kidding.
writer. You're the writer in the group.
Well, we'll see. But he Spufford, I will say it's weird to me that he likes Aaron Sorkin. That's actually kind of surprising to me, given how he writes in this and excerpts of other things and how interested he is in material and how like disinterested Sorkin is in material. But I guess sometimes you're attracted to things that are different than you.
He
That's
likes
fine.
dialogue. He likes dialogue, and not just spoken dialogue, but there's a cadence in certain parts of this book where narrator is is literally like, "Oh, here we go," kind of glancing aside to the reader, which is Sorkin-esque.
I guess, but well, we can hash out my beef with Aaron Sorkin on another day.
Oh, we will hash plenty of beef.
Yeah. Though I don't know where or when or how, but perhaps. Well, anyway, that's a pretty interesting overview of Francis Spufford, a still working writer. Unlikely to listen to this, but Spufford, if you are listening, don't take it too personally. I'm sure you're a nice guy, but I didn't dig your book.
Hmm.
Uh, Red Plenty is, to sort of give it an overall summary of what Red Plenty is, it is a book about the Soviet project, mid-century, mid to second half of the 20th century project of wanting to create plenty, of wanting to create an automated consumer economy. World War II is over. The sort of war economy has passed. Heavy production has been created in the Soviet Union. The heavy industry, metals and resource extraction and all that is now effective. Now it's a question of delivering plenty through a socialist system,
Hmm.
delivering a bunch of commodities, specifically cheap goods, not just the basics, but then abundance beyond the basics of subsistence. Um, that it's about that mission. That was a thing Khrushchev was big on, in real life. Khrushchev had this sort of dream of like full communism by 1980 that he talked about in the 1961 party program that this discusses. Um,
Which
and
is ambitious as all
Oh, it
hell.
was incredibly ambitious. And it was working under, I mean, frankly, there's a lot of history here. There's a lot going on here, between what really happened, what didn't happen. And this book, sort of exists in the space of historical fiction. I want to read what it says at the top about what this book is. I want to quote because he wants to talk about, because like, well, I'll let Spufford speak for himself. Quote, this is not a novel. It has too much to explain to be one of those. Parenthetically, there are 53 pages of endnotes, so not lying about that.
Hmm.
But it is not a history either, for it does its explaining in the form of a story. Only the story is the story of an idea. First of all, and only afterwards glimpse through the chinks of the idea's fate, the story of the people involved. The idea is the hero. It is the idea that sets forth into a world of hazards and illusions, monsters and transformations, helped by some of those it meets along the way and hindered by others. Best to call this a fairy tale then, though it really happened, or something like it. And not just any fairy tale, but specifically a Russian fairy tale. Where Western tales begin by shifting us to another time, once upon a time, they say, meaning else when, meaning then rather than now, Russian сказки make an adjustment of place. In a certain land, they start, or in the three times ninth kingdom, meaning elsewhere, meaning there rather than here. Yet these elsewheres are always recognizable as home. In the distance will always be a wood-walled town where the churches have onion domes. The ruler will always be a czar, Ivan or Vladimir. The earth is always black. The sky is always wide. It's Russia, always Russia. The dear, dreadful, enormous territory at the edge of Europe, which is as large as all Europe put together. And also it isn't. It is story Russia, not real Russia, a place never quite in perfect overlap with the daylight country of the same name. It is as near to it as a wish is to reality, and as far away too, for the tale supplied what the real country lacked. not, end quote. And frankly, this is a difficult thing to open a book with and then it be sort of historical fiction, sort of
Yeah.
not,
Hmm.
because that leans itself towards like a more speculative view. And this book is not particularly speculative. It is more just like, what is it inside the heads of these people carrying out this planned economy? And not like really more than that.
Yeah,
So
it's
it is
interesting to
weird.
me. It's interesting to me that, he has this conceit of, all right, this is a fairy tale, and the common denominator between the West and Russia with fairy tales is like you're being time shifted, you're being place shifted, you're being elsewhere shifted, which to me is like, okay, you're using that over there to make a statement about, your time and place, but he's not. He's
Right.
not.
This is all cited, like even
Hmm.
like facts and figures, not all of them, but like there's a lot of stuff here that it's like, yeah, that is how much like linen or pork costed. So it right off the bat, I'm like, why is this a fairy tale? I don't understand. Like, I understand it's not a novel. It's more of a collection of short stories that are well sourced,
I mean,
in their,
it has to be a fairy tale for socialists if it's a fairy tale at all, right?
I suppose. Yeah.
Because every fairy tale has a fable, right? Well, not a fable, a moral. That's what I'm looking for. Every
Hmm.
fairy tale has a moral, right? Every fairy tale has an allegory. It's got an origin and a story that people told to, make sense of the world around them. Particularly as a caution.
Hmm.
You're warning kids about the wolves in the woods. You're warning people about going too far beyond the bounds of your village and whatnot. And in this case, you're warning people about getting lost in the Soviet sauce.
See, in this case, it feels a little bit more like the fairy tale in question, by his own like argument, would be the 1961 party program, would
Yes.
be the in 1980, in a faraway time that's not that far away, we'll have this, 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 and this. It will
Mhm.
be Russia. We will be named Ivan and Vladimir, but the sky will be bluer and wider, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Um, I, you know, so that so yeah, right off the bat, there's a little bit of dissonance there. And I think throughout this, there is a struggle over like how much of a history this is, how speculative this is, how much does he want to make up, and how much does he really enjoy, using details to build like a sort of short scene. Because he is a competent writer of short scenes. He is
Mhm.
it is very well researched, and it's very confident competent in its writings. It'll say something like I've just got random quotes written down. Quote, most evening he walked. He'd start thinking about something in the park, burping back the taste of fish, and find his feet had carried him wishfully to the train station again. Hot slate-colored sky, the caboose lights of departing trains, wavering to nothing at the distance like pennies falling to a stream bed. A bit of music would have helped, but if anyone played live here, it was only ever oompa oompa, end quote. Like, it's well constructed. You get scenes that are well written. Um, it has one of my favorite openings to a chapter ever, which is towards the end in a pretty unremarkable chapter. Aside from, well, it's not an unremarkable chapter, but a pretty unrelated to this opening line that says, quote, Theodore's mother, unfortunately, was still attractive to men. Great
Mhm.
opening to a chapter. Things like that. Like he's kind of got that down. So if you see this as a collection of short stories, historical fictions, making a cohesive point where sometimes the same characters show up, um, yeah, that's what this is.
He's very good at the art of the opening sentence, right? He's very good at sort of drilling down to exactly what is eating the particular character that he's focusing on,
Mhm.
what's grabbing your attention. I mean, the very first one here, the prodigy, right? A tram was coming, squealing metal against metal, throwing blue-white sparks into the winter dark. Without thinking about it, Leonid Vitalyevich lent his increment of shove to the jostling crowd and was lifted with the rest of the collectivity over the rear step and into the cram of human flesh behind the concertina door, right? And then it's a very introspective chapter, this first one, because Leonid is our mathematician, right?
And a real guy.
Yes, a real guy. And no matter how hard you're lost in thought, you are still, your attention has to be grabbed by the train that you're waiting for. And he goes on to, it's a very sensory, long opening paragraph, right? You get really vivid descriptions of the smells, of the sights, and And in an oblique way as well, right? The smell of vodka merged with the sweaty sourness of the workers a little further forward, whose factory had plainly lodged them in a barracks without a bathroom, they
Hmm.
smelled like shit, and it's that roundabout way that sort of adds that finesse to the prose.
And Leonid is in this and also in real life a brilliant mathematician, a brilliant economist. He also, if you look him up, happens to look like Soviet George Costanza, neither here nor there. Um, but he developed techniques for the optimal allocation of resources. He is the founder of linear programming as a concept. Like he is credited with that in the East and the West. He won the Stalin Prize in 1949 and the Nobel Memorial Prize in Economic Sciences in 1975. Let me tell you, not easy to win a Nobel Prize as a Soviet in the 1970s. Just
Hmm.
wasn't happening. This dude was a genius. Um, and he, and this book, he's very important to it because his idea of economic efficiency and economic growth and basically building a planned workers' economy that can create a consumer economy without capitalism is kind of the dream of Red Plenty, the
Hmm.
alternative model for producing a lot of stuff. Um, and right off the bat here, we get into just the denseness of what this is. And I have to say, like, this is an incredibly ambitious project, and I respect the hell out of just how much there is here.
Hmm.
How much he cares about, like, Spufford cares about like getting the scene right. Like, oh, where'd the train be going here? What kind of ads would be up? This, that, and the other. Things that I wouldn't, know to check. And then even in his end notes, he'll say, okay, I cheated a little here. Actually, this ad wouldn't come out for another 6 months. It's like I actually I do respect that.
Yeah. Yeah,
But
no,
yeah,
you can
to
you
to
can
like
do a little bit of elision in ways that I don't think necessarily contravene his points, I don't think they necessarily do violence to what he's trying to say, except for there's one or two parts that I quibble with, but that's
oh
neither
no
here nor there
doubt.
for now.
But he does and all that detail comes to say that there are some things later on that he glosses over that frustrate me, but I'll get
Oh
to that.
yeah.
But I do think like grounding this historically is very important. And he does it a little bit here and there, but like the history of like the development of the Soviet Union is like something that like we certainly don't have the time to go into in fullness. There are many a book have been written on this from many a perspective, many a history. What we can say is this, and the book acknowledges this as most like because I feel like this is an important baseline for talking about Soviet economic development, and hopefully this doesn't put you to sleep. But the Soviet Union, prior to that being Russia, was a capitalist but severely underdeveloped country going into the 20th century that was incredibly reactionary, ruled by the czar, a horrible ruler. Nicky was not a friend. He was a terrible guy. Really underdeveloped, very much under the thumb of Western Europe, despite its power. Um, Absolutely devastated. World War One then comes, absolutely devastating. When you have the Bolshevik Revolution, it is not under the ideal conditions that Marx envisioned when he's talking about a socialist revolution.
Hmm.
That is not to say that we're like, oh, the Bolsheviks shouldn't have done a revolution. I'm just saying it's worth saying, hey, these were not the conditions of plenty. This was a devastated economy that then right after that to end World War One, they had to give away like half their factories and stuff just to end the invasion. And then following that, they had to fight a bloody war as a bunch of imperialist powers who'd just been fighting each other invaded the Soviet Union and backed right-wing elements, carrying out pogroms across the country,
Yeah.
burning grain. I mean, really horrifying shit. I think that the idea that like, I would recommend books like Stalin, A Critique of a Black Legend or Khrushchev Lied or some of those, if you're interested in that period. None of them are perfect, but they're worth looking into.
Hmm.
Um, but the Soviet economy had to do a lot of the lifting work that capitalism did in Western European countries and elsewhere, had to do a lot of that modernization. And frankly, like modernization, building like heavy industry sucks. Like under any economic system, nicely as possible, meanly as possible, anything in between. I know that's not material to say, but like it sucks. Like extraction and ore and oil and coal and building heavy metals and like that is just, it's going to suck no matter what. It's going to be terrible.
Hmm.
What this book acknowledges and what history acknowledges is the speed and efficiency with which the Soviet Union was able to accomplish that through the 20s and 30s. Um, has never been replicated before. Has never been seen before in human history, and the
Yes,
only country
it
that even
was.
rivals it is China.
Yes, it was without historical precedence,
And
anywhere.
China is the only country that's ever done anything remotely similar to it.
Yes.
In its level of development over such a space, not to discount other socialist projects, but and this huge development was brutal, and there was a lot of pain, and there was a lot of scarcity. That scarcity was not created by socialism. That was scarcity existed prior to socialism. And by the time you come into the 40s, you have this devastating World War II. I mean, and even prior to that, you have all kinds of, different intervention. You have blockades from imperialist countries. And then after that, there's continuing blockades, sanctions, attacks, attempted rebellions. I mean, it is an all-out siege. It was not ideal conditions for socialism. It was not the conditions that were envisioned even by the Bolsheviks. They were ready for Germany and the other countries to follow right behind them.
Yeah, yeah, that was the idea that there would be a certain level of development achieved within this or that advanced industrial country, and then the workers would overthrow it and seize it. It did not the development of socialism as people as many people were writing about and theorizing, did not presuppose the conditions of absolute devastation.
Mhm.
As I said, Jacob, that the Bolsheviks had to deal with. This is what really frustrates me, just anecdotally in like history enthusiast circles that I used to be more that I used to frequent more. There are so many stories from that period about dudes like the Czechoslovak Legion, right? The legion of dudes who like got on a train and like traversed Russia west to east, to escape like the forces of who? Of the Bolsheviks, because
Mhm.
it was a fucking white army legion, right? You have all these stories that people are like, oh, isn't this so cool? That are from the wrong fucking side of the war.
Mhm. And I also want to note, and there's something in this book almost mentions it, is the people who carried out the Bolshevik Revolution and also the original revolution of 1917 that overthrew the Tsar. The people that fought in 1905, the people who fought against the war in World War I, most of them, those hardcore partisans, die in the Civil
Yes.
War.
Yes.
The task of making socialism actually falls to people who were less involved in the socialist revolution. Another thing that no one intended. Now, that's not to say that they didn't pull things off. It continued to happen, mistakes and all. And then this is not a podcast that is going to sit here and judge the history of the Soviet Union. We're not
Mhm.
capable of doing that. There's too much. But it's worth noting, like, it's important to see the Soviet Union as a country in a system of countries, as a state in a history of states,
Mhm.
grounded in history. And then you can make decisions based on what you think is right and wrong, given that context.
Which
But
is the problem. So much of the scholarship around the Soviet
Mhm.
Union, so much of the discourse around the Soviet Union severely misunderstands it, right? And comes
Right.
at it from a very hostile perspective.
But like the question of, and it was a challenge, Khrushchev, and I mean Stalin at first, and then Khrushchev, and then Brezhnev, and all of them were faced with coming out of World War II of like, hey, look, we just got obliterated by World War II. America made money on it. And now we got to catch up with America's consumer economy. That that's not an easy challenge to be handed. And that is the challenge that this book introduces. I think the book could be a little fairer to the Soviet Union in the sense of like, given the conditions that they were going into this, you have Khrushchev visiting the United States, seeing all the wealth and being like, well, how do they have all of this or whatever? It doesn't really get into imperialism. It
Mhm.
doesn't really get into it. It throws its nods here and there, but regardless, the challenge is an interesting one. The idea that you can sit there as a Soviet, as a real believer in socialism, and say, holy shit, like, well, look what we have to work with. Look what they have to work with. How do we fight this economic war that Khrushchev has envisioned and catch up? And Khrushchev's calculation is, well, our economy is growing by X amount every
Mhm.
year. It's growing faster than the United States. We got to keep on this path.
And
And
notably,
it's interesting.
this is where we get into our second major point of view character, Nikita Sergeyevich Khrushchev himself.
Hmm.
He's on a trip to the United States to speak to the captains of industry there, to be like, hey, this is how we do socialism. I'll take your questions.
So this is from the perspective of Khrushchev in those early chapters after looking at the United States and thinking about it. It says, quote, some comrades seem to think that fine words and fine ideas were all the world would ever require, that pure enthusiasm would carry humanity forward to happiness. Well, excuse me, comrades, but aren't we supposed to be materialists? Aren't we supposed to be the ones who get along without fairy tales? If communism couldn't give people a better life than capitalism, he personally couldn't see the point. A better life in a straightforward, practical way. Better food, better clothes, better houses, better cars, better planes like this one. Better football games to watch and cards to play and beaches to sit on. In the summertime with the children splashing about in the surf and a nice bottle of something cold to sip. More money to spend, or else more of a world in which money was no longer necessary to ration out the good things because there were so many good things, all gushing out the whatchamacallit, the thing like a cone spilling over with the fruit. Ah, the horn of plenty. End quote. And it makes that point of like, and then Khrushchev says, show the dog the rabbit, show the Soviet Union what they're trying to catch in the prosperity of the United States. Everything included. And it's interesting that like, Khrushchev really did have this kind of perspective. He did kind of like, if you read what he wrote, you hear what he said. He had this idea of like outproducing capitalism, of like out capitalizing capitalism. That is not to say Khrushchev was a capitalist. I'm not trying to do like epic communists, like, oh, there's no real, like, I'm not doing that. I'm just saying he had this idea of like, well, if we can have supermarkets like the United States, then that means socialism is working, which, given going into this, you can see why that is going to be a challenge.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And and it's worth noting, Spufford does read what Khrushchev wrote. He does have a sense of the optimism, right?
Mm-hmm.
But that's the thing, right? He's setting up that optimism. He's setting up that vision to have it knocked down. Because where does the book end, right? The book ends with Khrushchev, sitting at home, retiring, totally cut off from what he's tried to build, and wondering where it all went wrong.
Mm-hmm. I do like the part, like it does deal with Khrushchev in like some interesting ways. It nails his kind of quirkiness in a specific like way. He's just like kind of this guy that loves to do his little bits. He likes to be excited. He's very excitable. He's, we all know whether or not it's true. I know it's argued about the banging the shoe on the desk story and all of that. He's got this sort of air of, in sort of charisma and this sort of, but also this sort of like not lack of formality to his analysis. But I think that like also comes from the fact that Khrushchev, both in this and in the real world, was just a worker who was elevated to, and that is something this book acknowledges some, is that like workers really could rise in the Soviet Union. There was a real capacity to go from coal miner to premier, like, you know what I mean? And that's an interesting thing. I like one part where it says, quote, whether or not they wanted him, that's Khrushchev there, the force and capacity of the Soviet state had obliged them to let him in. Think of it. Miners had gouged at the stubborn earth. Railroadmen had blown on their hands at dawns colder than rigor mortis. Machinists had skinned off bright curls of swarf. Soldiers had died in the shit in the mud so that one of their own could demand to be received in this quiet, rich room as an equal. Here he was. They had to deal with him. And I do appreciate that also as a socialist. It's like, hell yeah, they had to deal with him.
Yeah, no, I have that, I have that highlighted as well.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and and it comes right before he's talking to Henry Cabot Lodge, the Secretary of State, and other bigwigs in the American government. Right, he's at dinner with the captains of industry, and it's interesting his assessment of them here in the very next paragraph. Right, the capitalists look surprisingly ordinary for people who, in their own individual persons, were used to devouring stolen labor in phenomenal quantities. Their cheeks were not notably bloated, and for the most part they were wearing modest modern clothes rather than the uniform of striped trousers and shiny black top hat in which they had always been represented in the cartoons of his youth. Nor did they have the pig snouts the artists had given them, of course. But what minds of technique they must be all the same. what secrets of ingenuity they must possess as the owners, managers, contrivers of American abundance. He knew how it was to handle a workforce from his time driving the metro through. The best school in the world, learning how to give your crews the kind hand when possible, the iron hand when necessary, learning how to read a man's possibilities and his limits, learning when to listen to the specialists and when to override them, and learning shortcuts and tricks and traps. Knowledge had mounted up in him like floodwater. It must be the same here. These men here at the very top of American capitalism must contain whole reservoirs of distilled knowledge. And I have a note there that's a single word like nope.
Yeah, definitely not. If nothing else, this book does show that the elites of Soviet society were working. They did have to put in a day's work. That's for sure.
As opposed to
These guys.
calling somebody up and being like, "Hey, how do I pay less tax?" I do think there is a little bit of a sideways glance at the sort of man behind the curtain here, right? Because Spufford here says, Mr. Khrushchev, said Harriman, the millionaire who's the liaison here, right? I'm sure I speak for all of us, Republicans and Democrats, when I say how firmly united we are in support of President Eisenhower's foreign policy, right? Which, to me, if you're an anti-imperialist reading that, you're like, yeah, there is whatever differences may have existed between the ruling class parties. Fundamentally, it is the same ruling class operating against world socialism.
Mm-hmm. And so yeah, Khrushchev, he does his thing, and there is the American exhibition in the Soviet Union as well. In the 1950s, Americans come over and they show off, hey, here's what American stores look like, cars, clothes, etc. And this is the part I made the joke on Twitter that capitalism is win Tupperware. Because that is kind of what this part is. It is these students and stuff going to investigate, what is the capitalists have to offer. And they send in basically the Soviet government or the local party or whoever, send in basically some people to like be hecklers to point out the like flaws in the arguments or whatever. But
which, call me an authoritarian, call me a propagandist, but, I don't see anything wrong with that. I don't see anything wrong with having some theoretically inclined people there to put what is literally intended to be propaganda in context.
Mm-hmm. Regardless, you have Galina, who is like the kind of main character of this chapter. She's a student at Moscow State University, a member of the Commissar, very intelligent. She's a striver, this book has a lot of strivers in it, very intelligent people who are like, I'm going to rise in the party. I'm going to get a good job, etc. And yeah, you have, interestingly enough, the American exhibition features the very real 7-screen show that was designed by Charles and Ray Ernst. This was a show shown to Soviet citizens that flashed the scenes in a quote unquote daily life of an American citizen, which it was the average suburbanite. At least that was whatever. If you watch it, you can find it online. It was 7 screens at once that was flashing different scenes of like picket fence, and I mean, it looked like a Coca-Cola ad from the 1950s, but like 7 screens at once. It was meant to overwhelm intentionally. And in this book, I think Galina is supposed to be incredibly intelligent and incredibly whatever, and she gets like owned by facts and logic pretty easily by this like presentation of like seeing a lot of goods. This is where the book starts to like lose. Like, this is where the first few chapters, I'm like, okay, I'm with this. I see like it's a critique of the Soviets, but it's fair. It's whatever. And then I it's showing both sides. I disagree, but whatever. And then it gets into this, and it's just like Galina is like, oh, I saw a piece of plastic and now I'm so owned.
Because she keeps her cool in the confrontation with Roger Taylor later on, but I mean, certainly there is a sense as she's looking here. Here we go. She reached in her mind for the familiar comfort of her future, but the picture of the trim, comfortable life she had planned with Volodya, her guy, always so near and easy to lay her hands on until now, didn't seem to be where she'd left it. It had been displaced somehow by the picture show. She hunted quickly through her memory, expecting to find it shoved to one side by the press of this American stuff, yet still intact, still as tightly filled out as ever with reassurance. She hunted and hunted, but there it wasn't. She couldn't find it, couldn't frame it in her head as a solid thing. It had gone as if the scouring wind of images had blown upon it, and it had abraded away. Like, you get a sense right away that, as well versed as she is in what she has been sent here to say, right? There is this sort of nagging thing in the back of her mind that's like, okay, well, these guys have something we don't. And it's a sense that the rest of the crowd is, that you see the rest of the crowd is also caught up in, though perhaps less self-aware. And we'll get into the why of that when we talk about her confrontation with Roger Taylor, who notably
Yeah, you go
Notably,
ahead. Sorry.
yeah, who notably is a black man from America who's sent to be the emissary of the American way of life.
Yeah, which is true. There were some, I don't think Roger Taylor was a real guy, but there were some real black delegates to Moscow
Mhm.
during this exhibition. Notably, that was caused a big stink in the American Congress. There were some senators that it was a whole thing.
Which is incredible to me. Like you're sending somebody over there to, sort of smooth over the, what was known throughout the world as the horrific racial situation in the United States, right? You're sending people over to smooth that over. And there are people in Congress who are so racist that they don't even want to do that.
Yeah, the Soviet art, say what you will with Soviet Union, their art about American race relations fucking obliterated the United States. It was just always like there's one of like a KKK guy like anamorphing into a police officer and stuff like that. And that's a little over. It's not anamorph, but like it looks like it a little bit. Things like that. They did really get the US's ass on that regularly for like good reason. Read accounts of black people from the United States who traveled to the Soviet Union. People like people who were traveling over there. They said and also not just Soviet Union. You read about the Black Panthers traveling to China and stuff, and like how the experience was genuinely different. Read about Assata Shakur traveling to Cuba, like how in a government that is genuinely striving to, not be perfect, but create a multiracial democracy, or multiracial socialist country,
Paul Robeson,
multinational.
who,
Yeah, Paul Robeson,
felt
absolutely.
human. He said he felt human when he went there.
Hmm. I mean, that's not to say it was perfect and I want to make that clear as well.
Yes,
We are materialists here. We are scientific socialists, not utopian socialists. So if this book also, if this book was saying the Soviet Union was perfect, that would not be correct. But
right.
I find this, this part to be odd because Galina's not ready for this. And B, how quickly her vision of the world is shattered. I think I would buy it more if Galina had traveled to the United States and then seen a suburb and had her vision of the world shattered. I think this picture show and then just seeing some cars, I don't know. She's supposed to be this perfect, Soviet, and that's Soviet citizen, and that's enough to wreck her life basically. Because
Yeah,
it really
it's
does. She loses her purpose in life after this,
there
which
is a
is wild.
real there is a real mystification that she sort of stumbles into here. She they were the villains, the Americans in this story, right? She would have supposed that they would seize this chance and tell a rival story, a counter story in which they were the heroes. Instead, they seem to have come with no story beyond this untiring universal brightness, this glow spreading from every object. It's this very sort of, I mean, it's the ultimate idealism, essentially, right? It's something that's inevitable and unstoppable and dazzling, that she's powerless to resist.
And I mean, even when she asks, her guide about racism, he's like, yeah, the country's super racist, but it'll get better. Um, like, and, that's kind of I mean, it's definitely odd and it's an uncomfortable scene, her calling him out. And obviously there's odd tension there. But, the reason I stick on this is because Galena will recur later on with the scene of one of the most heavy-handed metaphors I've ever read. But we'll get to that when
Yeah.
we get to it. Once again, this is a series of short stories. It bounces around in time, in location. Some characters recur and some do not. And some of these short stories are more competent than others.
We have our guy in the next chapter here who is making the arduous trek to see his in-laws now that he's married.
I kind of like
Um,
this one.
yeah, White Dust, 1953. Yeah, this guy who has the best name in the book, Emil Scheidolin.
Hmm.
Fucking love that name.
Not a lot to say about White Dust aside from a few little bits. why he's just making a trek, and he's like, we're close to Moscow, but it's still dirty out here. We've got a lot of work to do. And Emil's, a believer in Soviet economics, and he's going to like make it happen. And it does have a bit where it's like economics can be intensely personal. And I did like, that is true. The idea
Yes.
of like, and the good.
I do like this bit here. Let this be a lesson to you, Mr. Economist, he told himself. Anytime you get imperious, anytime you start to mistake the big and closing terms you use for the actions and things they represent, just do remember this. Just do remember that the world is really sweat and dirt, right? And it's in the context of not being able to get a direct ride to the small village that his in-laws live in, right? He's got to take a bus to Alexandrovsk, and then he's got to walk in the hot, buggy Soviet summer.
Mm-hmm. And then
The
we get
Moscow
in,
region, I should say.
yeah. And then we get into part 2 of the book, which is these like parts open up with like italicized like essays or lectures or whatever. And
Yeah,
this
it's
part,
similar to the narration in the Crucible.
honestly, like this is like one of the things that felt like Kim Stanley Robinson to me. I mentioned it earlier, but like there are a lot of moments in here that feel like something Kim Stanley Robinson might do. I think Kim Stanley Robinson would do it better. But like this, or like the moment later on with the cancer cells, like what am I? I'm a cancer cell, or like the computer synapses firing, like these hyper detailed fixations on like different individual stuff to tell a larger story. And then these like pauses for philosophical treatises that felt very Robinson to me.
Yes.
Um, um, in a different way. But nevertheless, but like it talking about like Marx's vision, and it says, theirs was a system that generated use values rather than exchange values, tangible human benefits rather than the marketplace delusion of value turned independent and imperious. For society to produce less than it could because people could not afford the extra production was ridiculous. By counting actual bags of cement rather than the phantom of cash, the Soviet economy was voting for reality, for the material world as it was truly in itself. Rather than for the ideological hallucination, it was holding to the plain truth that more stuff was better than less. Instead of calculating GDP, the sum of all the incomes earned in a country, the USSR calculated net material product, the country's total output of stuff. And yes, that might sound boring, but it is important to note because the idea behind this is why the planned economy failed. They are thinking stuff orientation. They are not thinking about profit broadly. They are thinking about how much stuff do we need, how much stuff do we need by area, and how do we distribute said stuff. Notably, also why it's very difficult to calculate the GDP of the Soviet Union, always has been. That's not just like because the CIA because the American government and stuff like to downplay the Soviet success. It actually was and still is difficult to say in dollar amounts what the value of certain stuff is when you're not using dollars or really even rubles as an accurate measure, just as kind of like a useful standard.
Right, when it's inputs and outputs.
And I think this is something that the socialists online who seem to like this book did find interesting and did like about it as a legitimate critique of the Soviet Union. And they're kind of like, well, when we do our planned economy, we'll do it like this. And it's a little bit,
And especially here
to me.
Well, yeah. You're absolutely right, and especially here in the first couple of pages of Part Two's introduction, right? Spufford gives the game away. Like Marxists elsewhere in the countries where the revolution was supposed to have happened had settled down over the years since Marx's death as social democrats, running parliamentary political parties which used the votes of industrial workers to get exactly the kind of social improvements that Marx had said were impossible under capitalism. Which he doesn't really return to what happened after.
Yeah, that part was bizarre.
And he goes on to call the Bolsheviks a tiny freakish cult under the
wild.
Under the thumb of a charismatic minor aristocrat, V.I. Lenin, who had developed a doctrine of the parties and by extension his own infallibility. I mean, I don't imagine we have to get too into the weeds here, but part of the reason that they gained the mass following that ultimately they did was that they were consistently the anti-war party in a country devastated by war.
I think it's inaccurate. I know it's inaccurate to describe the Bolsheviks as a freakish cult. It's just, cool as that sounds, And like badass as it sounds, like just if you read the histories, you read what these people were doing, you read reminiscences of Lenin or like or anything on the ground, the history of the Russian Revolution. I'm not just talking about from like socialists. Read stuff written by, bourgeois people who are just genuinely trying to talk about the specifics of the history, talk about the letters. These people were on the ground interacting with normal people. Like these people were not sitting in their armchairs. There's a reason they carried out the revolution. Like if these people were just like posters came together, then they wouldn't have been able to carry out the overthrow of the government. They did very effectively and efficiently with mass support. Then we're able to fight off imperialist invasion from over a dozen countries, including the United States, by the way, in 1918 and 1919 and 1920. They were able to defeat the White Army. They were able to modernize. They were able to keep power. And this book even acknowledges that their collapse, the perestroika, came not from dissatisfaction at the bottom, but through actual failure of the ability to adhere to like Leninist principles, which I found it weird that the book admitted that, but it like specifically even
You're
says
talking
that.
about that little the bit at the end where what does he say? It's that bit where he's saying, well, in China they pull back they pull back from the socialist construction of the economy. They reintroduce capitalist relations under the Marxist-Leninist political framework. And in the Soviet Union, he says they do the opposite, right? They maintain the economic framework, but they effectively stop using the state as an instrument of class struggle.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I've got quibbles with the specifics of it, but broad terms, it was an interesting admission because like earlier he's like, this thing was a freakish cult. It was like, bad. But then here it's like, well, actually the Marxist-Leninist state works and it's functional and it's clearly the majority of people were behind it according to the text of this book. So I don't know. I find that to be odd. Like I think he's like from the get-go, his perspective on like Bolshevism is coloring his overall understanding of how this
There's
whole thing
also,
runs.
well, and I mean, even from the American perspective, and this is back to Khrushchev's introductory chapter, right? But you get a sense that there is a degree of myth making that that no matter your class, everybody buys into. Like the head of Chase Manhattan Bank, right, is talking to Khrushchev in that chapter, like, oh, finance capital doesn't have an impact on lawmaking in this country. You have to understand that if Wall Street likes a law, it's a kiss of death, right? You have the head of General Dynamics saying, well, we don't have a stake as a weapons manufacturer in whether there's war and peace, which, again, we know these things to be lies, but from the perspective of the people saying them, you get the sense that they believe what they're saying.
Sure. Absolutely. Absolutely. So, to like move it along, because we can also like individual theories of this, individual short stories we could really, really drill into, but we are trying to talk about the narrative overall.
Mm-hmm.
Next up, we have Leonid discussing a plan to better plan the Soviet economy, dealing with concerns about, revisionism and the idea of like, oh, well, if we do central planning and we do it differently, are we doing revisionism? Are we doing, progressive socialism? What are we doing? They're worried about the politics of it. So there's just like the individual politicking, the struggles of what reform and change looks like.
Shades here and there of people going outside and above and beyond the structures, right? Hey, murmured a latecomer, slipping into the neighboring seat in a cloud of better than Soviet cologne, right? Which is a first whiff of the black market ultimately that develops in light industry.
And the people who will then inherit Russia following perestroika, which
and,
you see a really interesting glimpse of them a little later in this book.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so everyone's kind of politically concerned. You have what's the one guy, Nimshinov, supporting him and them arguing, them doing conferences and them discussing like what's going to get you in trouble, what's not, what's revisionism, what's not. And it's if you're really interested in the details of the politicking, read the book. I'm not going to go into every single like individual little bureaucrat that shows up in this book. We'd be here all day.
Yeah. There are parts of this that are eminently skimmable.
Mm-hmm.
But again, as in a fairy tale, right? It's not truly the character that I think that you're focusing on. It's the contours of the story, right? It's the moral that is being expressed here, and in part, it's you see people getting bogged down in ideology and semantics here, rather than in the materiality of what's going on.
Hmm. And then you have this place that I'm going to attempt to pronounce. Apologies to any Russian listeners. Akademgorodok. You think I got that? Akademgorodok?
Akadem Gorodok, something like that.
Where the Gorons live? I don't know.
Yeah.
It's a town of scientists. And this part's, I like the town of scientists. I think it's cool. In my imaginary novel that I'm now creating, this speculative fiction novel about cyberpunk USSR, yeah, this is going to be a basis of this is going to be where the story is set. Copyright pending. But it's a town of scientists. They call the island because they basically have much less direct supervision. The real geniuses, the real heads get sent here. The people that the party trusts and knows is really good. And they're like, y'all need to come up with like the cool shit. And it's like people who worked on their atomic program, people developing computers. You got the real heads here. You see it through the perspective of, I'm sorry, what's her name?
Zoya.
Yeah, yeah. And you have a handful of characters here, and some of it's spent like flirting and hanging out and going to college parties and seeing the Orb Sea and which is a massive man-made reservoir, and debating these new ideas. And this part is definitely to show this sort of like dreams of the future, like to show the heads behind, like the minds behind the statements, the minds behind the vision of 1980, sort of. The people who are discussing this like utopia they're going to build and their different ways of doing it, and they're like hyper specific disciplines. And this part is, it's interesting. It's interesting to imagine this town and these people interacting. But ultimately, well, yeah, ultimately their vision's not going to come to pass. So it's kind of got this melancholy over it as well, of course.
Yeah, you have sprinkled throughout, right, this sense that there is some rot behind the Moscow is a set, and like all sets, looks more convincing from the middle distance than close up. Sasha Galich, who's a writer of propagandistic songs, yes, he'd started to brood lately on what was behind it, on what you would find if you peeled back a corner of the painted hardboard, which indeed people do later in the book.
Mm-hmm.
Once we get some of these medical facilities close up.
And then in this academic town of scientists, you have a discussion about the rising of meat prices. And they're like, this is actually good because this is going to move along our plan for our planned economy, for our Red Plenty program. So you see it kind of in this zoomed out way, like on top of the ivory tower. And then you see like going down to sort of the masses, the people who are working in the factories and stuff, how that impacts people. And you have not mass strikes, but you have localized strikes in another Russian name,
Novocherkassk, yes.
Novocherkassk, which is a real historical incident and is pretty fucking brutal. What happened?
Pretty bad, yeah.
And I mean, there's only so much to say about what happens there, but it's basically there's a large strike and the people are mad about the conditions, and
it has
it
to
leads
do
to police violence.
There's a price rise in meat, as you mentioned, and it's right on top of a pay cut, they say.
And they blame it on like local party leadership. It's like, yo, you did this all wrong, man. But like the people are, and then when people go to him, he's supposed to deal with them properly, and he fails. And it leads to a riot that is then repressed with police violence, which is not good. We're not going to defend that.
Yeah, no, we're absolutely not defending it. But I mean, what's interesting to me, because I was doing some reading about it, right? And was it handled incorrectly? Yes. Was it not well known and by design in the Soviet Union? Yes. Were people who were related to those who were killed inadequately compensated? Yes. all these things are true. What also strikes me is how unique this situation is compared to, say, what we see here in this country, with
Hmm.
police violence rising year over year and no sign of that being curbed, despite the world coming to, having to come to a stop for somebody like Derek Chauvin to get in prison, right?
Hmm.
We were talking about this earlier, Jacob. There's much more involvement from up high in the Soviet Union. There's much more responsiveness to such things happening, imperfect as they have been conducted. You have Politburo members coming to settle labor strikes, to negotiate, saying, "Look, what do you want?" Right? You
In fact, that was a
have
specific Brezhnev policy. Like it was
yes,
always a policy, but Brezhnev specifically was like, you gotta go to deal with these people. So I'm not a huge Brezhnev head. But that was what was happening.
right. You have. I mean, a lot of this book talks about um fundamental alienation from the consequences of the policies you're putting into practice. That takes place even under socialism. Something that something that those who believed in it figured they would was a sin of capitalism that socialism could correct, right?
Hmm.
The book talks a lot about that sort of alienation, right? And I mean, what is said at the end of this chapter is, you'll get used to it. No, I won't, Volodya. No, I won't. I think there is the sense that this sort of brutality was much more everyday than it actually was, right?
Hmm.
Like again, you couldn't imagine some high-ranking U.S. politician. I mean, look how long it took Biden to even get out to fucking East Palestine, Ohio, right?
Hmm.
You know, there is, imperfect as it was, there was a much more self-correcting dynamic at work here.
And also it notifies like, and it portrays it as a negative. And I mean, obviously there is no doubt that it was in some cases, but the fact that when like people in charge made mistakes, they were removed from the position. In this book,
Yes.
it puts you in the headspace of the people who are in charge. And yeah, I imagine it's stressful. And I'm sure, I know for a fact that sometimes that it was too punitive, but also, can you imagine your manager getting in trouble for something going poorly? No, the fucking people at the bottom in this country get in trouble when the production goes down. They lay off people. They don't lay off regional managers and shit usually. In this book, it's like, oh yeah, the regional manager has the answer, not the workers. Um, I don't know. To me, that seems like a better person to blame. Maybe they're being too punitive about it. But I don't know. Things
I
like
mean,
that, like,
we
oh,
we
you can
have
lose
we
your
have
job if you make a
open
mistake. Okay.
we have
People with power should.
open, we've open bribery, we have open insider trading in Congress, we have open pedophilia, hello, Matt
Hmm.
Gates. Like,
Yeah.
and nothing happens. Nothing.
Yeah. So, not to what about here. It's just a difficult thing not to consider when you're reading the book. But nevertheless, it's dealing with the challenge of a socialist state existing in the real world in a state of siege during the Cold War, during a genuinely intense time. I mean, it likes to throw out stuff like, oh, they were putting so much money in their military. And it's like, yeah, the threat of war was always over their heads,
Yeah.
nonstop.
I mean, not to take Kwame Ture out of context, right? But any analysis of this project is incomplete without analyzing the state of siege it exists under.
Hmm.
It's. I mean, this is really I mean, yes, not to what about, but also like when you are dealing with a project that is new, right? That is unlike anything before in human history, and that is attempting, in whatever ways it succeeds and doesn't succeed, is attempting to involve the great majority of working people in this construction. That is where you have the right to say, okay, well, what would you do differently when somebody when
Hmm.
somebody writes a book about how it was doomed from the start?
Hmm. We move along and, in the book and you have more people meeting other people talking about like, oh, well, we got to move around this part of the economy or to hit our metrics. We got to use this machine or that machine.
This
Frankly,
this 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 here, the method of balance here in part four, right? Like it's intriguing to me, because it's from the perspective
glad
of
it's
this
intriguing to
guy.
someone.
Yeah.
I'm sorry. Go ahead.
So Maxim Maximovich Mokov, right?
Hmm.
Maxim Maximovich Mokov was a very kind man. All of his colleagues remarked on it, you know. When he traveled in business, you know, he'd always bring back a thoughtful present, you know, here, you know, it goes on, right? It's a guy who is sitting up at the top making these decisions that ultimately filter down, right? He gets this message that, oh, there is this big machine that some freak industrial accident has destroyed, right? He says, okay, in the old days, heads would have rolled over this on principle. It would have been labeled as sabotage just to close the books on it. The organs of security would swiftly have uncovered a conspiracy of records, vilely determined to cheat the people of their rightful viscos. But the policy now was not to compound the effects of an accident by losing, in addition, the expertise of skilled workers over it. I mean, first of all, this is shades of how Reddit talks about the Winter War, right? This is, okay, like the Soviet Union just did a rough cut and executed everybody when something went wrong. I mean, but also, this is a guy who has incredible power of himself, doing all these calculations by hand, right, to resolve this sudden problem that's come up with the planned economy. And right here at the end, he says, he decided, do a little something to keep Solkenthib's minds on the job by tautening their coal and salt and sulfur supplies a tad. Bad luck might spring from carelessness and should be discouraged. So here is where it's a little bit bizarre to me that, you know, such an enormous machine. You know, I know what Spufford is doing here, right? He's saying that this enormous machine ultimately comes down to the whims of the people driving it, right? To people who are like, okay, well, I'm going to use this punitive force to sort of get the ball rolling in a different way, right? Which to me, I mean, it's not a problem of the machine as it is of the person driving it, you know, vibing.
Hmm.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think so. You know, it's a lot of, you know, individual things to discuss. And it is also difficult when you're dealing with like specific instances, right? When you're trying to tell a broad story of a big economy with specific instances, specific stories,
Yeah.
often of things going wrong,
I mean, again,
right?
this is an argument against, you know, complex systems, right? Not
Mhm.
against, you know, this system in particular. Sorry, go on.
Yeah, therein lies the problem, right? You can take any grand system, no matter how great or terrible or anything in between, and pick individual stories, with which to extrapolate a tale of the entire system. I mean, you just, you know, and
You know what this reminds
it's
me of?
difficult.
Like, this is neither here nor there. So when I was applying to colleges, this would have been like over 10 years ago now. My parents told me, yeah, you know, you got to apply to a whole bunch of them because you never know. Like, the person reading your application could have spilled buffalo sauce in his tie, and so in a fit of pique, he'll reject everybody who applies from Buffalo. And I'm like, what the fuck are you trying to accomplish with this anecdote here? Like,
I mean, yes and no, but that there is something to that though, right? Like
mm,
in the sense of like, if you were to say, but let's say that happens, right? Dude rejects everybody from Buffalo, and that's the story you tell. And then I have to make a decision about what I think about the entire American college system based on that.
mm,
That is a little how this book feels.
yeah.
It's and I know it's giving a lot of stories, it's giving a lot of perspectives, and some of them are more charitable than others, and the economy is working better in some other places than others. But it is like when it hones in on like, oh, the factory that deliberately does underproduction or whatever,
Hmm.
it does miss the fact that there are factories that are deliberately doing better and people are happy. It glosses over, it says like, it really yada yada is the part where it says, yeah, and most people actually did approve of the government. Like it yada yada is that. It's like, I'd like to see some of those people. If we're going to start telling the stories of individual people's lives, you
Which
know what
is
I mean?
weird, right? It does because it doesn't really jive with the with Galena being lost in a sea of people who are enamored with this thing that they ultimately decide they can never have. You know, it's especially early on. I think the book portrays the collapse of the Soviet Union as something much more organic than actually it was.
Right. Even though it acknowledges later that it's not.
Hmm.
Right? Like the book acknowledges the reasons behind the perestroika later on. We already said. But then it
With
feels like it's leading.
with a much more charitable picture of Gorbachev in the end notes than I think you or I would paint. Sorry, go on.
Yeah, 100%. Like I said earlier, it's not something I agree with.
Mhm.
Um, but it's different than the overall like if you see this thing as a collecting wave towards the fall of the Soviet Union, which this book self-describes as, it says this is the prelude to the perestroika. Not really. Like, you know what I mean?
I love,
Unless you want to talk about like bureaucratic incompetence, unless
yeah.
that's the argument you're making.
Well, and as we'll see, the remedy to bureaucratic incompetence is a little behind the scenes finagling.
Oh my God, I love this guy.
As yes, you know exactly what I'm talking about.
Yes.
Yeah.
It's
Chapter,
Mr. C. Mr.
yes.
C himself, because I really know what to say his name.
Chapter 3 of part 4.
Chekuskin, right?
Chekuskin, yes.
Chekuskin fucking owns. This guy's awesome. I mean, like he's not, but he's super cool. He's the guy who gets on the phone and makes sure the shipment goes where it needs to go.
He's a fixer.
He's a fixer. My man's a fixer. He's
Yeah,
not
yeah.
doing anything illegal. He's serving the plan. He's just can serve the plan a little better in one direction or another direction the other day. Next day.
Sometimes there's an industrial accident and things don't get where they need to go, so he'll call somebody up who has some stuff lying around that he can. So it opens. I do again. Spufford is really really good at catching. To do a little bit of writing 101 here. He's really good at catching the characters at the most interesting points of their lives, right? Somewhere that is a descriptive microcosm for what they do, right? And then immediately upending it. And what he's doing here, what Chekuskin is doing here, what we find him doing is he is taking is it a samba class? Is it a it's some kind of Latin dance class, right? Which he is taking as a favor from somebody that he's helped out. He has this mental, as we find out, he has this mental address book that he keeps everybody's like names, numbers, what they do, small talk to shoot the shit with them, to sort of grease the wheels a little bit. And that's how he coasts through life, right? Everything he does is calling in a favor here, returning one there, and making himself indispensable to everybody.
Yeah, he has a part where he says he's explained to a guy why he should be hired or contracted by his agency. He says, I'm a servant of the plan. That's what. I make what's supposed to happen. You can call me a purchasing agent. You can call me an expediter. You can be crude and call me a pusher. It's all the same thing. I help things along in the direction the plan says they should be going. I don't steal. I don't give bribes or take bribes. I persuade the wheels to go round. That's all. Here, have a glass of wine. It's not bad. It's Azerbaijani. I don't usually drink alcohol so early, bleated Stepovoy, or however you say his name. Of course you don't. You're at your desk. You want to concentrate, but now you're not at your desk. You're traveling on business for the firm, and you're interviewing someone who's going to be very useful to you. Believe me, so a little sip won't hurt. Cheers. And then he says, he goes on, and he's talking about like how he gets different stuff done. It's very like. He's a lot of fun. He's a fun character. And then of course you find out that he has ties to organized crime, which also gets interesting. But he visits like a bathhouse, like a hidden bathhouse where there's like a bunch of like criminals or whatever, that like tattooed criminals and shit.
And apparently, like, this was interesting. The Spufford says in the end notes, all these tattoos, have some sort of attestation in the historical record.
Well, there was one there's some like crazy ones. He says like there's the one guy where he's got a tattoo of, quote, a blonde in tears choking on the monster cock of the goatish commissar with the Star of David on his forehead.
God.
Like, what the fuck? Crazy shit. And all that to say is, notably, these are the guys actually who, inherit the Soviet Union after the perestroika. Like these, the mobsters, the gangsters, these guys, these are the guys who kind of like create the capital. I mean, with the help of like imperialists and foreign investment, they create, the new system in the post-Soviet states, in Russia, in Ukraine, and all the little ones. They are, no offense to the little ones, my heart out to Estonia and all y'all. But that's the new world that's created. It is inherited from these guys, these pushers, these wheelers and dealers, these salesmen. They are the new alternative. They are what capitalism will bring. Which it doesn't focus on, but it's hard not to think about.
I do love his turns of phrase, even if I don't like what they represent, right? So, Chekhovsky meets with this guy with the hideously anti-Semitic tattoos and whatnot, and then he gets picked up afterward by a couple of police dudes who have fingered him and figured out what's going on, and they rough him up. But it was not bright out now. It was full dark and damn near as thick with snow as in a blizzard, albeit the fall was all a slow vertical tumble rather than a horizontal blow. Shades of how Spufford's portraying the sort of slow slide of the Soviet Union, right? He was disappearing just kneeling here. The lieutenant had only meant to give him a scare, but he might have killed him anyway by accident if Chekhovsky didn't stir himself and get to shelter. Dizzily he stood and waded back to the highway, beating at the litter of perfect mathematical beauty which had dropped from the sky to his hair and his shoulders and his arms, which again, we will remember, right? That's the way that Leonid Vitalyevich talks about the world, right? Perfect mathematical beauty, the beauty of systems, of small things, in microcosm representing big things, right? And now you're in a sea of perfect mathematical beauty of snowflakes, and none of it is helping you get warm. The metaphor there is quite literally chilling.
Nice. Then we have this bullshit thing about the Bolsheviks as philosopher kings. I don't really know what to do about that. He makes the argument that the Bolsheviks are Plato's Republic, philosopher kings. It's just not a very good.
Stalin had been a gangster who really believed he was a social scientist, he says, which is wild to me.
Yeah.
Just read his interview with H.G. Wells, if you don't think he's a theorist of any kind.
No, yeah, he was you literally, I don't know anyone who was actually dealing with him at the time. He was a theorist. I think this is where it also loses me. I think that criticism works better when the criticism is fair, and also it'll say it will have criticisms that are legitimate of the Soviet Union, but then it'll do things like this where it'll be Stalin only thought he was smart. It's no, the dude was, or Stalin fancied himself a military genius. And it's This
is wild to me as well. About Khrushchev specifically, he had tried to stick his thumb in the scales of the strategic balance by putting the missiles in Cuba. No mention of the American missiles in Turkey, by the way.
Right. Or
I've just listened to the second season of Blowback. This is still fresh for me.
Right. I mean, it's the same logic as I don't know, read anything Marx writes, and he'll spend the first half of it being and capitalism is good at this, and it's good at this, and it accomplished this, and it pulled off this, because it's actually framing the critique and the plan and the overall arc of history in a real historical whatever. When you criticize something ideologically, you have to actually reckon with its positives and what it's been able to pull off and how it's served as a progressive force. And so when you fundamentally have these fundamental misunderstandings, it can be very frustrating, especially, and look, if this wasn't a book with 50 pages of citations, I'd be less frustrated about this, but it's not like Spufford hasn't done the reading. You know what I mean?
It's just that some of the reading is Anne Applebaum and Robert fucking Conquest.
Right. Yeah. That's worth noting. This is kind of Black Book of Communism level sources, which
some of them, not all of them.
Some of them. That's to be fair. A lot of this is legitimate, including a lot of the stuff that is used as critique. A lot of that is legitimate.
Yeah, totally.
I'm just saying you do have some of that shit spiced in there as well.
Mm-hmm.
It's not all saying Stalin killed 20 million people in Ukraine in a country of 30 million, and then Ukraine fielded a 15 million man force in World War II 5 years later.
Yeah, most Ukrainians fought for the Red Army, by the way.
Yeah. It's not all saying that level of claim. But it's it didn't, to its credit, it doesn't quite go fully down that road of everyone was executed in the whole Soviet Union, but
it flirts with it certainly, but
it has its moments where
we're not going to call this book an outright liberal fable.
Mm-hmm. So then, you have Khrushchev gets the axe. People are dude, we're done with this dude. We're not having it anymore. He likes corn too much. He does throw in a corn joke, which I appreciated. Real heads know Khrushchev loves corn. Big fan of the cornfields. This book says, a few minutes after being fired, he's still looking out over a cornfield, explaining the best way to cultivate corn. Good gag. Gotta hand it to him. And then, after that, it keeps moving. You have Emil arguing about economics. Once again, it's opening up this like thing where the economists are disagreeing on how exactly to implement their perfect system. They're realizing, holy shit, 1980s now only like a decade away, or not even, or like 15 years away or something. They feel this squeeze coming on them. They're making these different decisions. History moves on again. Like I'm not going to just, there's so many little conversations or whatever. I would rather talk about psychoprophylaxis,
Oh
um,
God.
because that's a more interesting way of discussing this than the individual economic conversations.
Yeah.
And we finally have the return of Galena, in a really horrifying circumstance. Uh, you want to speak on that, Lenore?
Yeah, she's by this point she's fallen out with the guy that she was with in way back at the American Expo, right?
Because
Volodya.
seeing Tupperware broke her brain too much.
Yeah, exactly. And now she's with this guy Fyodor, right? That's her husband. This guy Fyodor,
Fyodor,
yeah.
I hardly know her. Okay.
Okay. We had to do that. We had to do that
Uh-huh.
before we moved on.
And
Yes.
Fyodor's mother is the one who's unfortunately still attractive to men, and it throws in the detail that she fucks these men very loudly in their apartment.
Fyodor's mom has got it going on.
Okay, yeah, you're that counter-revolutionary execution right now. You've been charged with anti-Soviet crimes, and yeah,
What is that? Bowling for soup, bowling for corn? I don't know.
bowling for I don't have anything. Go on.
No, wait, it's
Bolsheviking for
no, is it bowling for soup or fountains of wayne? I always get those two mixed up.
I don't know.
I don't know. But yeah, so they're in a deteriorating marriage. Fyodor is kind of a higher up kind of dude. He drinks a lot. He eventually starts hitting her. Nevertheless, she's had a couple of abortions by this time, and finally they stop putting it off. They have a kid. And she's pregnant, and oh boy, it's time to go to the hospital and have the kid. And this is where,
Oh boy, I sure hope this isn't a metaphor.
yeah, and this is this assessment came to me like as we were discussing her at the expo, but there is something a little bit punitive about this. Maybe not punitive, but like,
No, I agree. It's a
yeah,
little masochistic.
yeah, there is a certain because she gets there and she's like, oh, you didn't. The nurse tells her, oh, you didn't take the psychoprophylaxis classes. You didn't take what essentially is like the
Like
um
Lamaze, basically.
yeah, basically Lamaze. And she's like, no, I didn't think that was I thought that was just like uh what was it? Like she thought it was just like childcare stuff. Anyway,
Yeah.
there's something that she was supposed to have read but didn't, that's supposed to like get you through the birthing process, and it's painful. And oh, by the way, the elevator's broken, so she's got to walk up the stairs while she's in labor. And
And the floor is dirty, and the nurses are mean,
yes,
and
which
and they're screaming. It's a
yeah,
bad
which
time.
again, there is testimony to like certain facilities looking like this here and there
Yeah, no
in the
doubt.
endnotes.
I'm sure there was. Yeah, I'm sure. It has, God, the description of childbirth here is just horrifying. Like, just what does it say? It says she's trying to breathe or whatever, and then it says the feelings change, quote, in quantity of discomfort and therefore in quality too, until they began to stab holes in her in deep breaths and leave her gasping with the breath forced up into a tiny bouncing flutter in her throat, and everything further down surging along out of control. It was not squeezing that she felt anymore. It was a crushing, a pulping. It was not
Mm,
stretching now, but tearing. It put her in mind of what she'd seen butchers doing in the big meat lockers, twisting apart joints against the angle of the bones, the cartilage popping, the fibers of the meat pulling out in red strings, end quote. And this goes on for like 3 pages.
yeah,
Like, it is fucking brutal. It's well written. I gotta hand it to him.
yeah.
It is, and she's like watching the clock, and I mean, it's just horrifying.
Yeah, the bit about the second hand failing her, I thought was a
Hmm.
pretty. I liked the craft of it, I should say, and ultimately because that's the thing, like she doesn't get painkillers for this until she pulls rank, until she says to the midwife, "My husband is the Komsomol secretary at Elektrozavodskaya," He has friends everywhere at the City Soviet, at the Party Control Commission. Some of them supervise the hospitals, she said, and the word hospitals came out with a hiss. They would be very upset if he were upset. Do you understand me? I mean, the metaphor here is not difficult to point out, right? It's somebody who's brutalized and whose life is made very painful and who is effectively failed by this system, who has to pull rank, who has to say, okay, I'm alienated from this, and I'm going to, leverage whatever illicit connection that I have to get what I need out of this system.
I don't mean to, derail anything, but why did Galena sound so turned on when she said hospitals? Says, yeah, the hospitals. The way you said that killed me. The nurse looking down at her. Yeah, no, terrible. Apologies. But yeah, no, and I mean, like, this part is all, it's kind of like, oh, well, it's the failure of the system and they are recreating hierarchy. And yeah, and yeah, I think you're right. I think it's like, it's kind of sadistic. It's kind of like, it feels a little bit like, yeah, you believed in the system and now you're getting ripped up by a baby.
Which, that's the thing. Like, it's not a sin to believe in this, right? It's not a sin to,
Galena doesn't really believe in it. That's the thing. Galena's had her beliefs shattered. So I don't even, it's a little weird that she's like the character here, right? Wouldn't it make more sense for the moment Galena doesn't like believe anymore to be here? I mean, it would be a really foul thing to do to make, I will say, to make a character like change political ideology and get owned by childbirth, but like it would make more thematic sense in the context of the book.
Yes.
The book also acknowledges in the footnotes that actually it was common for women to get painkillers in Soviet hospitals while giving childbirth.
I was about to say,
a little weird, but yeah, no doubt it happened. No doubt it happened. Neither here nor there. Worth noting, most American hospitals have VIP wings. So if we want to talk about, but
yeah, the Dollop has a really good episode on childbirth in America, and unfortunately, this is not a problem. Yeah, this is not a problem unique to the Soviet Union. And it's indeed like when there is a profit motive in childbirth, let's say, and say getting a C-section, as I was, happens to get the doctor out quicker in time for his lunch break, sometimes that's what will be pushed. Not saying that's what happened in my case, but that is a problem on an enormous scale here that is not being remedied by any political avenue open to people here.
Absolutely. As we know, you were a C-section because you were you're gonna fulfill Macduff style prophecy.
You know what, this is interesting. So I was born in Texas, right? And this was in 1993.
My condolences.
Yeah, I know. It's not great there right now, folks. But this was in 1993. So Roe v. Wade had been around for like 20 years at that point. And there was a non-zero chance that I'd be born with like developmental disabilities based on some tests. I wasn't, of course, but they needed an amniocentesis to confirm, right? My parents would have, raised me no matter what, but like the point is, they need to know what they're, about to deal with.
No doubt, yeah.
And the hospital didn't want to give mom the tests. You know why? Because they told her straight up, their words, "You're fishing for a reason to get an abortion."
Oh my God.
And that's, thankfully, my family threatened to make some noise about it, but, and ultimately got the test that they needed. But like, that's the thing, right? There is, under capitalism, there are forces of reaction, there are forces of, misogyny, and there are forces of exploitation that want you to, not even exercise autonomy over your own body, not just in the sense of, the right to get an abortion, as is on our minds lately, but, anything even adjacent to that.
Okay.
You don't.
But to be fair, that was 1993. Under the enlightened rule of President Joe Biden, everything's been fixed. Now let me just take a sip of coffee and open up the newspaper and oh no.
Oh, yep. Yeah,
there's gotten worse, folks.
Yeah, there's some fuck shit's gone down recently, hasn't there?
It's gotten worse, not better.
Yeah. My point being, like, this this is not a problem that is unique to socialism, but under capitalism, there's a hell of a lot less opportunity to make the reforms necessary. There's a hell of a lot less involvement in the struggle for it. Certainly not in the halls of power.
And at the end of the day, Galena went home with no medical debt.
That's the other thing. Yes, there's an infrastructure of childcare and of healthcare that existed there that doesn't exist here.
It glosses over the required week women have to spend in the hospital.
10 days.
For 10 days, completely covered by the state. I don't know, a little bit like it glosses over that, but like that's pretty cool. I'm sure not all of those women had the greatest time, depending on like the context, depending on how.
But again,
packed the hospital was.
Like no matter,
Can you imagine?
You use this anecdote as an indictment of one system. I can point you to any number of much more damning indictments of a system that cannot be reformed.
Right.
Exactly. As opposed to a system that historically wasn't given the opportunity to reform, wasn't given the opportunity to even develop on its own terms. That's the fundamental difference here. Yeah, I mean, all of this to say that, I've told my story. There are millions of people in this country who do not have those sorts of resources, A, but B, there existed a baseline in the Soviet Union that doesn't even exist here.
Well, you like metaphors.
I do.
Would you like another metaphor?
Yes, please.
Would you like to learn how lung cancer works? Because that's what the next chapter.
Yes. Okay. And again, you're going to explain it, but I'll just preface this by saying I completely respect what he's doing here. I picked up on it the first couple of times that he went through this. He goes through this like 5 times, and I mean, thematically, it's redundant with this horrific birth scene, A, but B, well, take it away, Jacob.
So Lebedev, one of the ministers, basically, he walks in to talk, who's he talk to? Is he talking to Topsian? Well, he's talking to one of them. Yeah, that's right. I can tell, I'm a socialist. I'm bad with Russian. Anything even remotely out there.
Well, don't worry.
Regardless, Lebedev, fair enough.
By his own admission.
Lebedev smokes mad, unfiltered cigarettes. Socialism is when you smoke 60 unfiltered cigarettes a day. Lebedev understands that despite all public health warnings, smoking is the hottest thing you can do.
It's pretty sexy, not gonna lie.
It's really frustrating. The anti-smoking campaigns, they want us to say it's not hot. We just got to reckon with that, folks. We got to reckon with it. Nevertheless,
we are a pro-smoking podcast. Everybody go out and tell your kids about no, please don't.
I do not smoke. The only time I've ever smoked was a cigarillo behind a bar one time when I was absolutely plastered and I coughed. I coughed and almost threw up on a guy I was flirting with. Did not get lucky that night.
Oh man, you almost pulled a Chainsaw Man on him.
Yeah. I don't get the reference, but I'll take your word for it. Nevertheless, Lebedev is developing lung cancer, and it just goes into the specifics of the machines of lungs are, they're when the foreign body's introduced, then this can happen genetically and this can, and there's a very small chance this could happen. And there's a very small, and it does it over and over as he's doing a scene. It's doing the smash cut back and forth of him talking about the economy. And then it'll cut to him and it'll be the hungry electron seeking blob of goop slips through there in the front of the floating 23 pairs of tempting targets. The huge fat friendly electronic rich chromosomes of human DNA. And it goes on and then it happens over and over and it says, this has happened billions of times. This has happened millions of times. This has happened. And then eventually
imagine the Mr. DNA scene from Jurassic Park, but it's half an hour long.
Right, exactly. And interspersed with no, if Mr. DNA explained this, then I would if he was the Politburo was sitting there and Mr. DNA dances in. He's like, let me tell you about why the Soviet economy collapsed. That would be kind of awesome. But But yeah, basically it ends up getting to like eventually lung cancer can be created if it keeps on, no matter how much inertia there is in the system, no matter how many breaks, there can be the ultimate failure of the system, and then that'll obviously kill Lebedev. And by this thing's convoluted logic, also kill the Soviet economy. Here's my question. In this scenario, I understand that the metaphor is that the heart and lungs are the economy that have a bunch of fail safes, but eventually they can fail and they only have to fail once to fail. What do the cigarettes represent exactly?
I mean, I guess the cigarettes are I don't know, whatever spurs this or that contradiction in the system, you know. I'm not gonna claim to be to be a diviner of Spufford's patterns of thought, but I mean, you know, it gets across nonetheless.
Yeah, and it ends with the effects of carcinoma on a major airway include shortness of breath, weight loss, bone pain, chest and abdominal pain, hoarseness, difficulty swallowing. It goes on.
I will
Um,
say, like
you know,
the presence of cigarettes, as an inciting force implies that, there are these external pressures,
mhm.
that ultimately beat the system down, you know.
Yeah, it's. I don't think it's actually trying to interrogate that, but nevertheless,
Right.
one could say the system is healthy on its own without the input from the outside.
Can I just read this really disgusting bit
Yeah,
here?
please.
It begins as a commonplace wheeze and uh when he coughs, she clicks her tongue disgustedly. True, it is a disgusting noise he makes. It begins as a commonplace wheeze in his throat, but tumbles down into his chest where it hacks and rattles and audibly moves clots of viscous wet stuff around, till the wet stuff has been dragged up into his airway, and he is in a gasping, gargling struggle to get it off his epiglottis and out so that he can breathe again. He spits into his handkerchief, clean this morning, now stiff and crusty, stained with nameless emulsions. He's been bringing up the traditional jade mayonnaise of bronchitis every winter for as long as he can remember. But this is something different, something thicker and redder and meatier, like liquescent liver.
Meteor. Ugh, gross.
Yeah. Again, I love where it isn't like hand carrying stuff over a rise, as the New York Times Book Review put it. I do like those individual prose moments.
And at this point, the book's kind of wrapping up. It wraps up with some of the characters in the town of scientists where it's like, oh, well, they're having disagreements and they're falling out with the government and this program's not working. The government's settling into its own thing and it's just decided it can make money on oil and continue to exist. Um, and you have like the return of Sasha Galich, the musician at one point. He sings like like a sort of snide anti-Soviet song at this party. You have anything to say about this part? I feel like it's just kind of wrapping up like the characters.
Not really. Like Galich is, I mean, for all the time that Spufford spends with him, and Spufford spends, say that 5 times fast. He spends, intimate moments with these characters, but I mean, we haven't seen Galich to my memory since he was introduced, right? Running that song past the censor, and now he's just like, look, I'll find my creative outlet among people who are also kind of fed up with what's going on here. And
Yeah.
there are spaces certainly for jokes and for discontent and for just a kind of simmering resentment of the system. But, again, I hate to keep harping on about it. The Soviet Union was dissolved against the democratic will of the people who voted on it. Like,
Hmm.
there are plenty of problems with it. There are plenty of contradictions. Its fall need not have been inevitable.
Mm. Highly
That's not,
recommend
since,
someone read
yeah.
something simple, even like Black Shirts and Reds or something like that. Really will go into that.
Mhm.
Highly recommend. Very accessible book. And there's plenty, but if you really want one that'll really go to it quick. Um, and then, the last chapter, you have Khrushchev. Khrushchev's bummed out. You got to
I
feel bad
do
for Khrushchev a little
I
bit
do
here.
find it interesting. Zoya's reading Dr. Zhivago here, apparently,
Oh
which,
yeah.
yeah, we were talking about this the other day. Like, it was, I mean, the whole book itself from beginning to end wasn't an op, but there was an effort by the CIA to help disseminate it in the West.
Hmm. So yeah, interesting thing there. I don't know if that's intentional or not, but
Well, it's stuff filtering in that ultimately, it's the you know I'm not saying Dr. Zhivago is cancer. I've never read the book. I've never read a word Boris Pasternak has written, but it occupies that space in Spufford's metaphor. Anyway, sorry.
sure. But yeah, the end you have Khrushchev and he's, bummed out and he's like, man, I wanted to do epic computer communism and now I live on a
Fully
farm.
luxuriated automated space
Gay
trans
communism.
communism. Yeah.
Yeah, trans gay communism with corn characteristics. And so he's just like chilling and he's like, well, this
Because
didn't work.
I
Man.
do love how this starts off, Like, I mean, I like a good arc,
Mm,
And what he's remembering here, he just had a nostalgic memory of the way the meetings had been at the beginning, in some raw-built concrete room under a bare bulb with a newly literate secretary stumbling proudly through the big words of the agenda. And he had hoped that he'd find something like that again, if they let him join in once more with the donkey work of painting May Day banners and giving speeches in lunchrooms and visiting kindergartens, expounding Pravda editorials to workers at shift end, make them laugh. That was the secret. Like it's something, especially that little parenthetical, right? It's the sense of a story relayed to you by, a very old relation who can only give you the barest sense of what this stuff was like and how fulfilling it was before, the structure that was built upon it became unwieldy.
one can't help but get the feeling that Spufford has like a little bit of fondness for Khrushchev. Um,
Yeah.
and Khrushchev is just a fun character in general. I've always wanted to, if I ever write historical fiction, have something with Khrushchev in it. Because he's just, if you read his transcripts of his conversations with anyone, they are just so funny. Like he is just genuinely such a funny guy. That that's not like very material. I'm not like doing an analysis of Khrushchev as a socialist. I'm just saying he's a very interesting guy. So I think
The funnier
Spufford
you are,
kind
the
of
better socialist you are.
that's true. That's true. I think that's maybe what just Spufford like spent too much time reading Khrushchev and he's like, man, I
Mhm.
got to give this old man something here. But I do like the idea because it doesn't have like Khrushchev's death in this book. So I like the idea that he's like on this farm, like kind of washed up and it's like, you could imagine like someone showing up and it's like Khrushchev, we got to go on one last job.
Mhm.
We got one, like a Logan style story where Khrushchev returns.
Nick Fury comes to Khrushchev and he's got the kid from Amelis. Like we're putting together a team.
And he's like, who's gonna lead it? And then he's like an old friend, and then like Stalin like steps out. It's like robot
Yes,
Stalin or some shit, or like fucking
Mecha
robot,
Stalin.
or
Let's
like ro
go.
or like Lenin's head like controlling a mech or some shit. It's like yeah, the whole we're bringing back together a team,
See, this is
you
the
know.
thing. Like under socialism, like when there is a common fund for people to pursue whatever film projects, whatever music projects, whatever creative efforts they want, right? You're gonna get a lot of I don't want to say vanity projects, but you're gonna get a lot of crazy shit,
Hmm. Some
and
of it
that's
might
going to
even be
be
good.
that's going to be beautiful. Not all of it is going to be good. A lot of it's going to be cringe, but it's you look for outsider arts, right? Like you look for outsider arts because it's genuinely unlike anything you've ever seen.
Snap, this one is going in my cringe compilation, but we respect the try, comrade. Um, I want to read the last paragraph of the book, how the book ends, aside from the end notes. Because right after this Khrushchev chapter, the book ends, and um, it returns to Leonid, and it says, and this is east of Khrushchev. And when the light fades, the flesh is gone, the room is empty. Years pass, the Soviet Union falls, the dance of commodities resumes, and the wind in the trees of Akademgorak says, can it be otherwise? Can it be? Can it be? Can it ever be otherwise? And that's how the book ends.
Well, I mean, the answer to that is necessarily yes. It has to be. I mean, we we live in a world that is only just now seeing the effects of the pollution and climate change of the 1990s. That's a lagging indicator. It's going to get much worse. We live in a country where real wages have been stagnant for our entire lifetimes. We live in a world where, there's a whole bunch of regional wars breaking out because the United States is flailing as its hegemony declines inevitably and necessarily. And, going forward, it has to be otherwise. There has to be a paradigm, globally and in all its various incarnations that involves the great majority of people in its construction and accrues to their benefit, because if not, we dead end. And I don't want to Again, I don't want to harp on this too hard. I think Spufford says, yes, it has to be otherwise. Yes, it can be otherwise, but only if things go differently. It is just astonishing to me that, one would reserve such, that one would view the Soviet Union in such in such a light as he's doing in retrospect here, as something that was started with good intentions, but that ultimately became something very brutal and terrible. Because certainly there were problems with it, but for many millions of people, it was the first taste of being masters of their own destiny, of having a genuinely increasing standard of living that their parents didn't. I mean, you look at China now. You look at China now and its elimination of extreme poverty in that country. Have there been contradictions along the way? Yes. Listen to our Three Body episode and me poorly explaining the Cultural Revolution. All this, that, and the other. But you have to get past the profit motive. You have to get past the ruling class of people that seeks to own and control everything, that does own pretty much everything. And that's why I find this book so frustrating. Because there are bits and pieces of it, as we'll touch on in the end notes, that are just wildly, out of proportion with reality, and handed down to us from that same ruling class. Like, it's frustrating.
No doubt. And notably, like, you don't even have to look at the Soviet Union. Look at Russia. Look what happens when the Soviet Union falls. Look who inherits it. Life expectancy collapses there in a massive way.
7 million excess deaths,
Yeah.
The highest highest in any peacetime era since the Black Death.
The country is intentionally basically inherited by like gangsters and stuff, like by the dude with the anti-Semitic tattoo.
Yeah, I mean, just look at there's a on I think it's on Vimeo, but I'm going to support the artist as well, of course. There is a short video essay called the fall of communism as seen through gay pornography. I think that's the title. And it's about the flood of young Eastern European men into a sex industry that is just salivating at the prospect of people whose assurances are suddenly stripped away.
Right.
You look at that and you tell me that the fall of the Soviet Union was a net positive. I dare you.
Yep, you have the United States having to directly intervene in Russian democracy and Russian parliament and everything to keep socialists from retaking power in the country. And I don't know when you're listening to this, but as of today, which is the 5th of January, 2024, there is a brutal war going on between Ukraine and Russia.
Mm-hmm.
That would have been unimaginable. In the time of Red Plenty, would have people, that was just not on the table. There is, and we don't know where that's going or how that's going to end, or there's so much. And, like we can obviously go into Russia and how it's changed and what it serves and how it serves as in some ways as a block to American imperialism. That's not really the point here. My point is that there is the introduction of capitalism, the abandonment of the planned economy, call it what you will, but it wasn't, it didn't the dance of commodities resuming did not, guarantee commodities to these oppressed and downtrodden masses. It did not guarantee freedom to anyone. And I think anybody who is reflecting on this and looking at the future, we have to ask ourselves, well, what do we learn from the past? What do we learn from books like this? And what do we learn from, real history? And what do we learn from our own experiences? And how do we look towards the future? I also just want to note, like, just on the matter of just the practicality of a planned economy, like a super planned economy, if nothing else, we certainly have the capacity now to do some of the things that were not technologically feasible for the Soviet Union to do with computers, with digitization, with just like cyber control of the economy. So if nothing else, we have that. If you want to just talk about like failures in the system of like the system didn't account for this, that, or the other, if nothing else, we have that. And right now that technology is being used towards the hyper optimization of the collection of capital. It is being used towards figuring out how high it can raise rents without evicting enough people to lose profits.
It is being used
things like that.
It is being used to, make predictions of how many civilians are going to be killed in this or that strike on Gaza in Israel.
Right. It's planning. It's planning. Now we have the capacity to plan. It's just what it's being planned for. So why don't we plan it towards human good? We have no reason to not do that, no matter what may or may not have happened, what failures may or may not have occurred in a similar plan in the 1960s, even in the most uncharitable view of it. And that's where the book ends. I mean, there's a bunch of endnotes, but
there's a whole bunch of endnotes with, I
like
think,
50 pages.
Yeah, and with the fiction stripped away, it's some of the most heinous. It's some of the most interesting stuff in there, coupled with some of the most heinous stuff, like that bit that I told you just the other day, like where he says, "Oh yes. In 1939, the jazz musician Eddie Rosner, finding himself stuck in Warsaw during the German invasion, presented himself to the Gestapo and demanded assistance as a German citizen, omitting to mention that he was a Jewish German citizen. They lent him a car, and he had himself driven straight to the Soviet forces who had seized the other half of Poland under the terms of the Nazi-Soviet pact. I mean, read the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. It's not a deal between Hitler and Stalin to carve up Poland. Poland doesn't even take top billing in Molotov-Ribbentrop. The Baltics do. It refers to spheres of influence, diplomatically speaking, not, not, hey, I'll conquer this, you conquer that. Like we're close enough to the end here that we don't need to get into the weeds of it. But like, there's stuff here that is, it's 2010, of course, it's 2024 now. Things have progressed along, but by this time the Soviet archives have been opened. We've learned a lot since then, and we are still debunking a lot of the nonsense that people peddle.
Yeah, absolutely. But nevertheless, seeing all that research, seeing all that time put in, seeing all the specificity, one has to be impressed by the work Spufford put into this. One
Absolutely.
has to be, I think he's very smart. I think when he's interested in craft, when he doesn't get lost in the weeds, he's quite a good writer of prose. I think he can kind of forget himself and, kind of go off on a tangent, and lose his prose. But when he really wants to, he can write some really harrowing shit. I think as a short story writer, as a constructor of scenes, he's very competent.
Yes.
And I definitely would return to him. I'm definitely interested in his new book, Cahokia Jazz.
That fascinates me. I can't wait to read that.
Yeah, I'm very interested in it. I know he's also like edited some anthologies, and so like he's very interested in history in general, and he gets on certain kicks. He's a fascinating guy. And I don't want to like walk away from this as like I'm not walking away from this book like I walked away from like True Allegiance or something,
No, because True, I mean, the difference between this book and that book. True Allegiance is just a straight up like, white nationalist fable. It's nothing like this.
Right. But at the end of the day, I'm frustrated, not just because it's a critique of something I believe, because that's neither here nor there. I can handle that, but I'm frustrated by the gaps in it. I think that at moments it's also just like, oh my God, to get to the point, as we said. But at the end of the day, hella ambitious, sparks a lot of thoughts. There's a lot of directions you can go from, and as you can tell, it definitely bears reckoning with in some interesting ways. And so at the end of the day, I guess it's kind of like, I would call it, maybe it's good, maybe it's not, but it's certainly something that like I'm impressed by, but I was also, it's something that like resists me like trying to rate it or something. You know what I mean?
Well, that's appropriate because Spufford likes to write about stuff that resists being written about. He's a challenging author to be sure, and it's a challenge that I'll happily rise to when I'm not reading about what he thinks about the Soviet Union. The Robert Falcon Scott expedition to Antarctica in his first book. I'll get to that sometime this year because that's a fascinating part of history to be sure.
No doubt. Well, folks, I think my takeaway is somebody needs to do this, but write what would happen if Leonid had figured out the ultimate supercomputer, and then write like a Fallout style or like whatever alternate history. I think that would be interesting.
Yeah, I mean, my takeaway. It's the sort of thing where he has put more effort into constructing this fairy tale than I certainly have in tracking down everything to refute it. Maybe it's not materialist of me to say this, but I am still driven by the knowledge that there has to be something better than what we have today. And it's hard not to look through history and see shades of what could be.
And I'm driven by a charismatic leader of a freakish cult.
Fuck yeah, you are.
Well, that's basically what I've got. This has been, I say that like we didn't talk for like 2+ hours. Like that was like I said, almost nothing. That was a heck of a read, but I was, we did it. We went through it, and that's the new year. That's how we're ringing it in. We're ringing it in with Red Plenty. So, I would say, 2024 is the year of the socialist shelf. You hear it here first. By 2025, biggest podcast in the world, and maybe even 100th biggest book related podcast in Canada. If we can break that, that would be even better.
Yes. The
one or the other.
The People's Moose Javian Republic will rise to prominence.
Thank God. Well, folks, next week, hopefully, if you're listening to this when it came out, as it comes out, that it'll be next week. If you're listening to it later, then maybe you'll be able to just scroll and see it. We will be recording an episode on Tony Kushner's The Intelligent Homosexual's Guide to Capitalism and Socialism with a Key to the Scriptures. It is a play, and we will be joined by AJ Diddy of the Worst of All Possible Worlds podcast, which we know y'all love. So very excited for that one.
Yeah, that I'm looking forward to. I haven't read Kushner since college, so this will be a nice trip back.
It's also going to be, absolute tonal whiplash, but as someone who considers himself an intelligent homosexual, we'll see. I need my guide. We'll find out if I'm intelligent, and we'll figure out if we can unlock the scriptures as well.
Yeah. It's people have been trying to do that for 2,000 years.
But with our three heads together, I think we could do it.
Exactly. That's well within our capabilities.
Absolutely. Well, folks, just to close it out, I want you to remember something. Capitalism is when Tupperware. Socialism is when unfiltered cigarettes. Don't forget it. Have a good one.
All right. Be sure to smoke, everybody.
Bye.
Thank you for listening to Socialist Shelf Radio.